Alan Watts's iconic lectures continue to inspire millions of people more than 50 years after his death, blending centuries worth of spiritual wisdom from traditions all across the world into a grand vision of oneness with the universe and effortless living. But there's a catch. The idea of effortless spiritual and personal growth that he taught actually runs counter to many of the traditions that inspired it. Worse still, it might even leave you powerless to overcome your own demons and achieve true personal growth, as unfortunately might have been the case in his own life. This is a frank appraisal of Alan Watts. So I'll start with a bit about the man himself. Watts was born in England in 1915 and was fascinated by Zen Buddhism from an early age, serving as secretary of the London Buddhist Lodge at just 16. In his early 20s, he moved to the US and continued his Zen studies in New York, but he declined to enter into formal training to become a monk. Instead, he became an ordained Episcopal priest in 1945, which looks like a strange turn for a student of Zen Buddhism, except that Watts was convinced that Christian mysticism and Zen Buddhism were really pointing at the same underlying truth. More on that later. He left the priesthood in 1950 over a scandal regarding his embrace of open marriage and free love. And he then joined the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, where he taught and studied for several years before going fully independent and embracing a life of writing and lecturing. By the time he published his breakout bestseller, The Way of Zen, in 1957, he was the most popular interpreter of Eastern thought in the Western world. He was really the voice who taught the counterculture of the 60s what Zen really meant, groovy stuff. But in his personal life, he was consistently tangled up in vices, mainly womanizing, nicotine, and alcohol, and it seemed to get worse with age. During his final years, it's reported that he was drinking close to a bottle of vodka a day, and his friends were openly concerned about his alcoholism. At the same time, he was forced to maintain an intense lecture schedule to keep up with his alimony and child support payments for his 7 children from his previous 2 marriages. He died, exhausted, in 1973 at age 58, most likely due to a heart condition. Okay, so that's a brief picture of the man himself, but what was his actual philosophy? Well, if you boil down hundreds of hours of lectures and books, a lot of it comes down to 3 key ideas. The first is the idea that the individual self, as we know and typically experience it, is a myth. Most of us go through life feeling like an ego, like a solid self riding around inside your body, looking out at a world that isn't you. We conceive of ourselves as an ego in a bag of skin, which is one of his characteristically vivid metaphors. But Watts says this whole understanding of ourselves is a myth. It's a hoax, even. The self and the world, the organism and its environment, aren't actually 2 separate things. They're one organism. They're one thing, and you are actually the whole thing. Everything that is you and everything that is not you is equally part of the same universe. Each side of the equation depends on the other. You and not you, self and other, being and non-being, they come about together, and you can't have one without the other. So once you realize that the self and everything else form a grand unity with the universe, your understanding of reality becomes, unlocked, and you become enlightened. You realize that your single solitary ego is just an illusion, and you're actually just the universe experiencing itself for a brief moment in space-time. He liked to say that we're all just the universe playing hide and seek with itself, and all manner of other exciting metaphors used to express this key concept. And he also taught that this idea shows up throughout many ancient traditions, including Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Christian mysticism, and more, whether or not it's a faithful interpretation of those traditions, but more on that later. The second key idea is non-duality. Watts not only rejects the opposition between self and other, but also between all pairs of dualistic opposites that populate Western philosophy. These dualistic pairs divide the world into binary opposites and privilege one side over the other. So being over non-being, truth over falsity, beauty over ugliness, goodness over evil, and so on. The self versus the other is just one species of this more general illusion. And Watts believed that many Eastern philosophies have a superior understanding of these dualities because they appreciate their underlying unity. In other words, they embrace non-duality. For example, the Chinese cosmology of yin and yang, and the Hindu philosophy of Advaita Vedanta. Both of these embrace non-duality as a core concept. They recognize that so-called opposing forces must rise and fall together, that you cannot have one without the other. And both of these ideas naturally lead to a third, which offers a model for living once you've accepted the first two, namely the Taoist ideal of Wu Wei. Nowadays, scholars typically translate it as non-action, but Watts understood it as something more like not resisting, or not clutching, and letting things be as they are. And this ideal of Wu Wei naturally follows because its opposite, effortful exertion, always assumes a real self and dualistic thinking. We want to work hard to do something because we conceive of ourselves as an individual ego that will be in a better position at the end of our work. And that better situation is usually understood in terms of one or more dualistic values, like a longer life rather than a shorter life, more money rather than less money, more happiness rather than less happiness. But these are all illusions, just like the self is. So the conclusion is to Wu Wei. Don't force it. Accept the unity of all things and allow things to naturally unfold as they will. And this is a sort of effortless ease that enlightened people master by identifying and moving with the forces of nature. He talks about living with the grain of life rather than going across it, swimming with the current rather than against it, and many other examples, analogies, and Zen stories that illustrate the ideal of allowing things to happen of their own accord, even if one appears lazy or silly doing it. So these three ideals do a lot of work for Watts, and they form a pretty complete system. And it's very nice sounding, inspiring, and even beautiful philosophy. Dispelling the myth of the self and rampant dualistic thinking leads us naturally to the idea that a life well lived includes the least amount of force. Because all the force and effort that we try to exert is rooted in illusion to begin with. But there's a hidden and more controversial fourth assumption in Watts's thinking that he doesn't often say outright, but it animates the rest of his philosophy. And it's something called perennialism, or the idea that there exists a perennial philosophy that transcends and unites all spiritual traditions. And the idea is most famously associated with Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, who wrote another book called The Perennial Philosophy. And Watts seems to have accepted this idea more or less. He met Huxley and admired him and was influenced by him. The basic idea is that underneath all the surface differences, all the great mystical, spiritual, and religious traditions are just expressing the same fundamental truth. In his autobiography, Watts writes that through his studies of the various religions of the world, he wanted to go behind the screen of literal dogma to the inner meaning of symbols, to the level at which Eckhart and Shankara, Saint Teresa and Ramakrishna, Saint Dionysius and Nagarjuna are talking the same language. The resulting spiritual enlightenment is more or less the same. It just wears different costumes. Same summit, many paths, that sort of thinking. And what's important in the case of Watts is that if you believe in perennial philosophy, you can take the best lines from each tradition and blend them together, because they all point to the same thing anyway. And that's why Watts can put a Zen koan next to a Taoist parable and then quote Jesus and tell a story about a samurai, all in the same lecture. These diverse ideas are presented as if they're all of a piece, because after all, they're all pointing to the same mystical reality. Now, most scholars nowadays don't actually accept perennialism. The main reason being that smoothing out the differences between the various spiritual and religious traditions tends to ignore their unique historical context, and sometimes obscures their very real contradictions with each other. Not to mention, serious practitioners of any one tradition typically reject it. Christian monks certainly don't consider themselves to be Zen masters, and vice versa. So perennialism can lead to groovy spirituality, but bad history, and it's been criticized pretty heavily since the 70s. But I don't want to litigate perennialism here, I just want to make people aware of it as an underlying assumption in Watts's thinking. And to be perfectly fair, Watts isn't trying to strictly interpret or follow any one of these traditions. He's drawing on them for inspiration and building his own vision out of the borrowed parts, and that's fair game. The trouble is that in his lectures, it's sometimes hard to see where the Taoism or the Zen ends and the Watts begins. He tends to present his own spin on these traditions as if that's what they actually taught. And so if Watts is your only window into them, you can come away with the right idea about Watts, but maybe the wrong idea about Taoism or Zen or Buddhism more generally. So those are the three key philosophical ideas that get visited and revisited throughout Watts's lectures and writings, and the concept of a perennial philosophy that makes it all hang together. Now I want to turn to the practical side of his philosophy, and this is where things get a little dicey. So Watts believed, perhaps infamously, that most serious, disciplined forms of self-improvement and spiritual practice are unnecessary. And this is because the ego is an illusion and we're already one with the universe. So every effortful attempt at pursuing enlightenment or spiritual awakening is contradictory and misguided. Because again, it's all done in the service of an ego that doesn't exist and ideals that are fundamentally illusory. And as a result, it runs counter to Wu Wei. And so he argued that you don't actually need to do very much in terms of spiritual practice in order to achieve enlightenment. You just need to understand a few key metaphysical theses, namely the three that I already mentioned, plus the underlying idea of perennial philosophy. And once you understand that, the serious spiritual practice or discipline becomes unnecessary and maybe even counterproductive. You don't need to do any serious meditative work or study the scriptures or whatever. You just need to sort of get it and then go with the flow. And this is where we start running into pretty serious problems. And the first is that this view of enlightenment runs directly counter to the practices of those traditions that he drew upon. And serious practitioners criticized him for this. Some called his approach wayward mysticism, or even lazy mysticism. Because for the vast majority of Buddhist, Hindu, Zen, or Taoist practitioners, and even masters, it takes a lifetime of sustained practice to achieve anything like an enlightened existence. There's different meditation techniques to master, rituals, textual studies, fasting, internal alchemy, and all manner of spiritual discipline. And these traditions all agree that some version of it is absolutely essential to walking any of the true paths. So just take his understanding of Wu Wei from Taoism for an example. He markets it as going with the flow. Don't force things, don't clutch. And that's basically right as far as the ideal is concerned. One example he loves to give is sailing. Sailing is a far more intelligent mode of propulsion than rowing because it takes less effort. You let the wind push you instead of trying to force it yourself. But the problem is that sailing is hard. It's really hard. Reading the wind, trimming the sails, learning to tack, that takes years of skill, and the apparent ease only comes later. In fact, rowing a boat is much easier to get the hang of, especially when there's no wind. Sailing only looks easy and effortless when you're already an expert, after you've already put in the work. And that's the whole thing the analogy misses. And many Taoist texts and practitioners fully recognize this. Acting in a way that appears effortless is what you earn at the end of a lot of training. It's not an attitude that you put on at the start. There are some minor exceptions scattered throughout Taoist writings that really do seem to advocate doing nothing, but they are the exception rather than the rule. Because at the end of the day, the advice to just go with the grain of life is inspiring, but it's also pretty useless if you don't know what you're looking for. And it's a consistent theme across several thousand years of mainstream Taoist teachings that it takes decades of sustained cultivation to get there. It's not something that you just intuit and understand all at once. Another example of his message cutting against the grain of his preferred source of inspiration is his arguments against Zazen, or sitting meditation in Zen Buddhism. And this is something that even D.T. Suzuki, who heavily influenced Watts, criticized him for. One of Watts's signature arguments from the way of Zen is that this practice is optional. Because forcing yourself to do seated meditation in order to get enlightenment is a contradiction. It's not spontaneous, it's not Wu Wei, it's disciplined and requires effort, and all effort is contradictory. Now, he wasn't anti-meditation completely, and he absolutely encouraged spontaneous, undisciplined meditation. But if we try too hard to meditate, then we fall into the trap of trying not to try. The second you try to achieve enlightenment by meditating, you've already failed, because you're trying to achieve it. Instead, enlightenment has to come in a way that's unforced, natural, Wu Wei, going with the grain of things. Now, certain schools of Zen Buddhism, specifically the Soto school associated with the 13th century monk Dogen, recognize something like this point, that there is a wrong way to meditate that's too intentional, that's too instrumental. They recognized that there was something off or counterproductive about meditating so that you achieve enlightenment. But their solution wasn't to make meditation optional. Instead, it was to rethink the role of meditation and its purpose. And they did. They conceived of it as an expression of our Buddha nature, not a tool for achieving it. Meditation allows the Buddha nature to flow through you unimpeded because it's already within you. That's why you meditate, and that's why you still have to do it seriously in order to live like a Buddha. But Watts didn't really take the second half of the lesson. Instead, he took their suspicion of meditating the wrong way to conclude that it doesn't really need to be done seriously at all. In other words, he took an argument against the wrong kind of effort and read it as an argument against any effort, instead claiming that we should meditate whenever we feel like it in whatever way works. Standing, sitting, laying down, walking in the park. Just go with the flow, man. And while there's certainly value to doing this, the suggestion does fly right in the face of centuries of mainstream Buddhist practice. And that's something to think about. A final practical problem I'll mention is that the advice to live spontaneously and go with the flow, I think pretty easily slips into complacency and excuse-making for one's own character flaws and vices. And sadly, we can sort of see how this played out in his own life. In recovery, they often say that you can't think your way into better acting. You have to act your way into better thinking. But Watts's program tries to do the first thing. It argues that as long as you understand the fundamental truths, you can live in a way that's spontaneous, aloof, enlightened, and fulfilling, without actually having to discipline yourself. And he makes this case explicitly. In many lectures, Watts argues directly against the whole idea of self-improvement as an intentional exercise, believing it to be hypocritical, contradictory, and even impossible. It's a case of taking one's role in life too seriously, of not being wu-wei, of feeding into dualistic thinking and the myth of the ego, and so on and so forth. And you can see how this kind of thinking might in turn justify a life of easygoing excess. And near the end, it caught up with him. He was once hospitalized for delirium tremens, a severe form of alcohol withdrawal. And when a friend came to visit him and asked why he just can't stop drinking, he reportedly said, "That's how I am. I can't change." And to me, this is just tragic. A philosophy that promised total freedom by letting go of the ego left him unable to resist the vices that were destroying his body. And so this is also why I can't really recommend Watts for pursuing any sort of serious personal or spiritual cultivation, at least not on his own. And this is important because I know that's why a lot of people turn to Watts in the first place. If you put on a Watts lecture because you're stuck or anxious or hurting, his core message is just to relax, don't try so hard. The self is really an illusion and you're one with the universe, so there's nothing really to do or worry about. Just observe things and let them happen as they do. And people find strength in that, genuinely. And for a while, it feels great. It's therapeutic and even liberating. And I'm sure the ideas have helped millions of people relieve stress, get to sleep, or even take that first important step on their journey towards spiritual development. But feeling inspired and improving your life are two different things, and Watts's recipe for the first thing doesn't necessarily translate to results in the second. Again, at least not on its own. So yeah, be careful with Watts as a source of inspiration for spiritual practice. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, if you just want a smooth and comforting British voice from the 60s saying inspiring things over calming music or a lo-fi beat, go for it. There's a massive catalog of Watts's real lectures on YouTube, and they're a pleasure to listen to. Try to avoid the deepfakes if you can. Watch out for YouTube's new AI tag on the bottom left-hand corner of videos. If it has this tag, then it's almost certainly a deepfake. And just be mindful of the channels that you're watching. The AlanWatts.org channel is certainly reliable, and I'll link to it below. But real or fake, after watching this video, I hope that you'll treat him as the first step on your spiritual journey and not the destination. So while his message is certainly one worth hearing, perhaps more than once, I'd like to encourage you to take the advice that he actually gave to his students as recorded in his autobiography. That once you get his message, you should probably hang up the phone and seek out resources that can help you take the next step in your personal journey. So if one of his lectures makes you curious about Zen or Taoism or Christian mysticism, great. Follow that and keep going past whatever Watts or his AI ghosts have to say about it. There are rigorous, free, and genuinely interesting resources on these topics everywhere these days. Watts is not the only window into Eastern wisdom like he was back in the 50s and 60s. On YouTube alone, Religion for Breakfast is great, and so is Let's Talk Religion. And honestly, even asking Claude or Gemini or GPT to walk you through the basics of any of these traditions will probably teach you more than endless hours of Watt's lectures, although it probably won't be anywhere near as enjoyable. But of course, it's always nice to check back in once in a while. So that's all for this Frank appraisal. I hope you enjoyed, and if you learned something, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more Frank philosophy.